have Emma Dymock presenting the paper, At the Age of 12, I Took to the Gospel of Socialism, Sorley MacLean, Gaelic Poetry and the Politics in the 20th Century. For that, I just want to say a quick biographical note about Emma. Emma Dymock is affiliated to the University of Edinburgh. She completed a PhD on Sorley MacLean in the Department of Celtic and Scottish Studies in 2008, and she currently teaches classes in Gaelic literature and culture in the same department. She has co-edited White Leaping Flame, so I'm not going to say that again, Sorley MacLean's collected poems, which came out in 2011, and she's currently preparing both the Sorley MacLean Douglas Young correspondence, oh, sorry, I can't say that either, the collected poems of Douglas Young for publication in 2016. Please help me welcome Emma.
Thank you, thanks very much. So in the autumn of 1875, Mary Vaughan and Oren composed Ilithio, Island of Mist, a poem of her native Skye in which she lamented the suffering of her people during the clearances, their self-sufficiency in the face of hardship and injustice, and voiced her optimism at the emerging crofter struggle. Ach caiinnigiv gur sluashiv is kumav suas ukor. Remember that you are a people and stand up for your rights. More than a century earlier, so I'm working back the way now, in 1747, following the Disarming and Disclothing Act, Myrick Hamble used her poem, The Highland Dress, to protest against what she felt were draconian laws, directly engineered to strike at the heart of the Highland way of life, and appealed to public opinion to press for change. And if the court were to consider it, change will come yet. Earlier still, in the late 17th century, Roderick Watson and Clarissa Dahl, the blind harper, was effectively using his poem, Oren du Verklodge Gunvegen, Song to MacLeod of Dunvegan, to criticise and satirise the spendthrift absentee chief, whom the poet felt had abandoned his tenants and forsaken the reciprocal relationship between clan and chief in favour of a life of luxury among southern strangers. So what do these Gaelic poets and poems have in common? Well, they're strongly political, and they all use the power of the spoken or written, in some cases word, to voice their opinions and speak up on behalf of the people. Now, I could cite many more examples from the 17th, the 18th and the 19th centuries which further illustrate this point. That's just 3 examples, but there can be no doubt that that irrespective of social standing, whether a poet enjoyed the patronage of a clan chief, or later when the clan system had perhaps crumbled a bit and the crofting community had risen to take its place with its own poets of the people, Gaelic poets have been extremely conscious of their role as spokespersons for their community for centuries. Now, this attitude is ingrained in the oral and the written record. The Gaelic scholar Michael Newton writes, quote, in a fully operational Gaelic society, professional poets had been custodians of tradition and mediators of power. They legitimated or criticised the right of leaders to rule and reinforced social norms through praise and dispraise. The increasing role of Scottish Gaels in British political and military affairs reinforced the heroic age ethos of Gaelic poetry, and rapid changes and tensions in the Highlands gave plenty of cause for social commentary. Royalist movements, Jacobitism in particular, mobilised Gaelic forces of traditionalism, with poets performing a lead part in the promotion of particular perspectives and campaigns. But let's now fast forward to the 20th century. Does any of this older, of oral poetry have any bearing at all on the sensibilities and the attitudes of modern Gaelic poets, such as Sorley MacLean, who these people were operating in a very different kind of set of circumstances, namely a written tradition in which movements such as modernism exerted a significant influence. So tonight I want to explore the legacy of the Gaelic political engagement, mainly in relation to the work of MacLean and his contemporaries. What I hope to demonstrate is the ways in which tradition and innovation have influenced the development of a strong element of revolutionary opinion in 20th century Gaelic literature. So for the purpose of tonight, it's kind of necessary, I think, to identify a blueprint of political poetry in Gaelic that can cover numerous centuries and political movements, because there were many, and which still enable us to see the common threads running through this wealth of political poetry that Gaelic offers us. Almost like a kind of political add-on to the Gaelic panegyric code. And I've made a kind of modest beginning to this blueprint, and it's as follows. So I've highlighted a few various expressions of bravery and courage. That kind of seems obvious, I suppose. Not only in relation to fighting for a political cause, but also in voicing, because obviously poetry is such a part of that, voicing that political belief, perhaps even in times when it was dangerous to do so. Secondly, a sense of duty to a cause, and that's very important for Sorley MacLean. This can be rooted in family, in clan, and or the wider community, and also later a duty to an imagined community, and I think that's especially important in a 20th century setting. And also kind of tacked on there a sense of nationhood. That's not always necessary though. Thirdly, the poet as spokesperson for political injustices. The Gaels were very good at that. In a Gaelic setting, this is intrinsically linked to community, and often in conjunction with a kind of underdog and or might is not necessarily right ethos, and that's especially the case in the 19th into the 20th century. Also, the intertwining of political identity and self-identity. This is a kind of an historical dimension with clan identity coupled to politics, but also significantly a sense of socio-political inheritance relating to individuals. So other poets and figureheads who have gone before. So that sense of inheritance relating to the poetic landscape as a whole. And finally, on the subject of landscape, the politicisation of that landscape. So that can relate to inheritance, especially in previous centuries, and ownership, but also even into the 20th century, that sense of a kind of stewardship of land. So by the time we reach the 20th century, Gaelic poetry has contended with many political issues. So we've got the loss of the clan system and the portrayal of the chiefs. We've got the Jacobite risings, the Highland clearances, the land agitation, and the formation of the Crofton community. And each of these periods have spokespersons in the form of poets, and Sorley MacLean emerges from this tradition. I think that's quite important. He shows a great deal of self-awareness of the Gaelic political engagement that has gone before him. He was born in 1911 on Rassie, and he grew up within a rich Gaelic tradition. He particularly remembers, he says, his father's mother singing the great Gaelic songs to him, and his aunt on his mother's side knew many of the songs of Mary Vore. And it's worth noting that MacLean's rich background in Gaelic oral culture was often at odds with Rassie's strong free Presbyterian tradition. So he shows an awareness of how the two traditions don't always sit well together when he writes that his mother's family had learned many old songs from their MacLeod mother, even though she was a pious adherent of the Free Presbyterian Church. Now, this tension between the two may have been one of the reasons why MacLean grew critical of the Church from a young age, and he writes that his scepticism of the Church's politics, quote, seeped through the protective walls of the individual very early and made for pessimism and, I believe, toleration and a sympathy for the underdog. At the age of 12, I took to the gospel of socialism. So as an aside here, note MacLean's use, and I really like this, note his use of language. He might have rejected the structure of the church, but he can't quite escape its rhetoric. It flavours even his description of his politics, the gospel of socialism. MacLean later describes himself as a communist, and his poetry of the 1930s and 1940s reflects this motivation and belief system. Unlike his friend, the poet George Campbell Hay, who was more influenced by Scottish nationalism, MacLean's choices are based on his communist ideals. He hated fascism and he wanted to eradicate it at all costs. This is what powered him into the army in World War II, and actually what fuelled his regret at not taking part in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. And in contrast, George Campbell Hay took to the heather for a number of months to resist conscription, believing that he should fight in a Scottish rather than a British army. So we've got both poets showing courage and an unflinching sense of duty to their political ideals, something that their poet predecessors would more than likely have admired about them. Much of what I've described so far in relation to MacLean is biographical. It's gleaned from his own essays and his correspondence with others. However, how does MacLean's poetry fit into this historical Gaelic political blueprint that I've already discussed? And how does this kind of reinvent the role of the poet of conscience in the late 1930s into 40s? So I want to look at poems now. So two of the poems in which MacLean consciously acts as a spokesperson for injustice are Banagale and Calvary, and I've put, I know we're not going to have time to sort of read through all the poems, so I've got the excerpts on the 3-page handout. So Banagale, A Highland Woman, was composed in 1937 or early 1938, so quite early in his poetic career, and he describes the appearance and situation of a woman who could be viewed as a symbol of the Gael, particularly the Gael under suffering. He directly addresses Christ in the poem, asking if he has seen the hardship of the woman. The depiction of the woman almost renders her a religious icon herself. The emphasis on the martyred aspect of the woman is not an accident, since it effectively compares her suffering to the suffering of Christ. As well as being controversial in a religious sense, the poem is political in the way it sets out the woman's plight before the reader. The woman can have no hope in her life as long as society remains unchanged. And she says, she describes in excerpt 1, he describes the black sludge. And this black sludge is described as seeping through the thatch of her home, and is the same as a symbol of the morass in his long political poem An Cúilín, the Cúilín. This black sludge represents capitalism, which MacLean believes is responsible for the position of the Highland women, the cause and the legacy of the Highland clearances. In fact, I think Sorley's like the one poet that I know of that talks about capitalism and the bourgeoisie in all his poetry. It seems to really come through. I think it's the first poems I've really read those words in Gaelic. But this black sludge seeps in and it obliterates hope. It's doubly evil because evidence of injustice is also removed from the eyes of the world. So that's really what MacLean's all about. This idea that as a poet, he feels he's got to show that to the people that he's writing for. So MacLean's showing his political and poetical motivation in voicing the injustices of the people. And if MacLean was looking to the history of the clearances for inspiration for his poem, it was a more urban setting which influences the second poem on the excerpt 2, Calvary. In this he alludes to the slums of Glasgow and Edinburgh where poverty and pain exist. He shows again that his concern is with the politics of the here and now. So that sense of viewing Sorley as just a kind of Highland poet, that takes that out of the equation when you've got a poem like Calvary, because it's so rooted in the urban. And significantly, this role of political spokesperson that MacLean has cast himself in is something which he appears to link directly to his the people that came before him in poetic terms, the likes of Marivor the Norn. In his poem An Cúilín, the Cúilín, he worries that the morass, this kind of bog underneath the mountain, has seeped into his own soul, and he feels the presence of this 19th century sky poet at his side, and that's excerpt 3. MacLean's personal sense of duty to his land makes him feel uncomfortable in the gaze of poets who have gone before him, and shows the weight he feels in relation to this self-imposed political duty to his people. So no one's placed that upon him. He's placed that upon himself. But I think it's such a powerful image in the poem. This idea that this woman is just at his shoulder. He feels her. Almost as a physical sense of the poets that went before. So this sense of duty is continued in much of his war poetry in the 1940s, but he uses these war poems to also break from panegyric assumptions of what a hero should be, and the Gaels had a very specific idea of what the hero signifies in the poetry of previous centuries. But as you can see in excerpt 4 in Curian heroes, and note the plural there is quite important, MacLean writes about an English soldier who showed great bravery in the desert, but who meets a decidedly ugly and non-heroic end face down in the sand. It couldn't be further from that sort of Gaelic poetry of showing the heroic death. It was the complete opposite of that. So from the outset of MacLean's poem, it's clear that while this poem praises the hero's bravery, it's not traditional Gaelic praise poem in which the hero is superior in appearance or accomplished in the deeds he carries out. The subverting of traditional poetic devices thus becomes a way of accentuating the modern predicament and showing up the horrifying landscape of modern battle. And I think Sorley MacLean's not the only Gaelic poet to do that. We have First World War poets who do that very well as well, and other Second World War poets, but it was a good example of it. Although only one man is described in the poem, the plural heroes of the title underlines that MacLean is aware that this is not an isolated case, and that many brave individuals are needed to make the existence of political heroism a reality, and not just a romanticised concept. He also mentions that this fallen soldier would gain no posthumous medal, and that his fallen comrades would not be able to vouch for him. So there's a little bit of a hint of the expendable nature of the troops that he is amongst. So he's willing to commemorate death in the way that Gaelic poets have done in earlier battles in earlier centuries. But what makes MacLean's poem both modern and politically significant at this time is the fact that his communist principles in the poem show that he is concentrating on the collective aspect of heroism, and while these same principles directed him into the army to fight against fascism, the political picture that he paints is far from simple. Basically, he's not, I think he says this himself, he wasn't a pure conscript in the British Army. He says that in a letter to one of his friends. So MacLean's Gaelic identity has always been inextricably intertwined with his political identity. In Dolenea, going westwards, despite his communist-led argument that all soldiers, irrespective of which side they must fight on, are equal and in the same boat, he lists his clan connections and their corresponding attributes. And that's in excerpt 5. And he says, the line, "I am of the big men of Braes," shows that his clan identity can never be completely buried. So there's that pride underlining something else. However, I think MacLean's Gaelic identity in relation to politics actually goes further than this, and is all-encompassing, more all-encompassing than the lines of Dolenea. MacLean's personal political heroes are referred to many times throughout his poetry. If MacLean viewed himself as a Gael, first and foremost, then his identity also included the cultural links to Ireland. MacLean gives a very special place in his poetry to the Irishman James Connolly, who was born, I think, in Edinburgh, and went on to found the Irish Socialist Republican Party, and was eventually, of course, executed for his part as one of the leaders of the Easter Rising in 1916. And we've got that lovely connection between Irish Gaeldom and Scottish Gaeldom. MacLean refers to Connolly by name in a number of times in his early poetry. He pays tribute to his politics and his perceived bravery in Dan de Aver, in Poems to Aver, and he also mentions them in several parts of Anculian. However, it's in Ardvisé and the Heron where MacLean makes his most sustained tribute to this man. And that's perhaps no surprise. If you've got a choice of Irish heroes to mention in the poetry of MacLean, Connolly is going to be your obvious choice, because he's the clearly defined socialist presence in a group of political and cultural nationalists in Ireland at that time. So I think I'm losing track of my excerpts. I think that's excerpt 6. That's excerpt 6. And he begins the poem with this, I was going to say lovely image, but I don't know if it's a lovely image, but it's Connolly's bloodstained shirt, which he wore when he was executed. But it goes on to bring the political situation more firmly into the present. And the mention of the Irish Troubles, for example, and the acute pain MacLean feels at these events as a Gael, that's the significant thing. So this shared heritage of Irish and Scottish Gaelic culture and mythology is also important. And again, you see that in excerpt 6 with the mention of the throne or the seat. The underlying suggestion from the poet is that the socialist cause, his socialist cause, is more important and indeed holier. So again, you've got that mention of religion where it perhaps shouldn't be. It's holier than the right of coronation of the Irish kings. But by fusing the symbols, MacLean is also mythologising Connolly's death within a specifically Gaelic-centred worldview. So he's doing quite a lot with that symbol. And he actually, I don't have many examples for this, but he does the same thing with another of his political heroes, the Scottish socialist John MacLean, who of course is synonymous with Red Clydeside. And there's actually no family connection at all, I don't think, with John MacLean. But you get the sense that Sorley MacLean is very proud of the fact that they share the same surname. And I think that's quite significant in the 20th century, because while you've not got the same sense of shared identity in a clan, the imaginary community is at work here. So he's welcoming him, Sorley is welcoming John MacLean into that kind of imagined community, that imagined family of Gaelic socialist heroes. So while other Gaels maybe wouldn't have described themselves as socialist, MacLean is doing that. He's kind of going back and almost rewriting history in that way. And actually neither Connolly or John MacLean were Gaelic political heroes, but Sorley MacLean exhibits a talent for rewriting these symbols, these figures and images of his tradition, and incorporating new figures who make sense in relation to his identity, both as socialist or communist and as Gael. He's trying to have his cake and eat it, I think. So in one way, he's developing the tradition, much as his predecessors did during the land agitation of the 19th century. However, underlying MacLean's contemporary context is the idea that these heroes contain an essence, and I don't really like using that word very often, but an essence greater than the sum of their parts. They can be simultaneously Gaelic and universal. So I don't think MacLean's politics stop at naming real figures and people in his poetry. He does that a lot, and that's a very Gaelic device. But even the landscape in MacLean's work is politicised. In MacLean's long political poem, Anculian, the poet searches for hope, heroism, and a sense of his own identity while climbing the Cuillin peaks in Skye and surveying the whole history of mankind from its heights. So it's a vision poem with ghosts of political figures and poets moving around the mountain. But while the names of Connolly, John MacLean, Dimitrov, Lenin, Alistair MacVister, Alistair, the Jacobite poet, they all meet and mingle on the mountain. It's the Cuillin itself, or herself, I think I'm more likely to herself in the way that he talks about the Cuillin, who becomes the most significant character in MacLean's poem. So in the 7-part poem, the reader is given the sense of the sublime nature of the mountain, of the Cuillin, and the awe that MacLean feels as he climbs its slopes. And as MacLean witnesses his vision of the destruction to the masses caused by fascism and capitalism, the mountain seems to react to these atrocities in a physical sense. So that's in excerpt 7. We get that sense of, and there's actually there's other ways of describing the idea of the screeching of the mountain. That is actually, when I was researching my PhD, that was one way of it's a kind of weather and mountain together. But he kind of gives it a human form, and I think it's significant in his work. It shows that he's so connected to his landscape, back to that kind of Gaelic sense of land and ownership and inheritance, that he expects or imagines that the land will come out in sympathy with the suffering of the people who stand upon it. And obviously that's his self-perceived sense, but the idea that the people who belong on the land, not the chiefs, not the landowners, but the people who are on that land, the mountain is at one with them. And it's this which perhaps holds the key to the complete and overarching political mindset of Gaelic poets across the centuries. The land, which was once a symbol of what the clans were fighting for and were willing to sacrifice life for, i.e. something that they owned beyond monetary ownership, is now so fully part of the poet's vision that it's almost an anthropomorphic personification. And most importantly, this land is in agreement with the political beliefs of its poet. So, in conclusion, Sorley MacLean's poetry is actually very close to the political poetry that came before the 20th century. And I know that often we kind of like to separate the 20th century from what went before, but I don't think that's necessary in any way. He still held great store by the traditional Gaelic sense of action and the pride in clan identity, family name, even if you're stretching that family name a little bit, and a collective Gaelic, a shared Scottish and Irish inheritance. His political sense of duty stretched to socio-political concerns, and a direct line can be drawn between the early socialism of the crofting community and the belief in the importance of land and its link to the people who live on that land. What gives MacLean's poetry its modern edge is that he explores traditional landscape images using modernist devices that allow the landscape to be fully alive to the point that it develops human characteristics and traits, reacting to political injustice as if it were a fellow human. But what of MacLean's legacy? And I'm going to fast forward a little bit again. The Gaelic poets who followed MacLean, those who emerged into the postmodern era, have understandably been influenced by MacLean's work, and indeed the other Gaelic greats like Derek Thompson, George Campbell Hay, Ian Crichton Smith, etc. And I think that what we may be seeing in Gaelic poetry after the mid-20th century is a political engagement based on community focus rather than the big issues such as fascism and capitalism that dominated much of the work of the Gaelic modernist poets. For example, there has not yet been another Anculian composed by a Gaelic poet in the late 20th or early 21st century, although I live in hope that we will see this, but perhaps this is the wrong attitude. The political climate has indeed changed again, and politics of the small p now takes centre stage more than it perhaps once did. I've noticed a trend in more recent Gaelic poetry to engage in minority language issues, for example, and also the political issues surrounding education. Anús MacNichol deals with the difficult legacy of the teaching out of Gaelic in schools, while the likes of Miles Campbell has raised the issue of environmental change and the politics associated with that. Significantly, while Gaelic poets have previously voiced opinions on Scottish nationalism in the 1970s and earlier, the effect of the events of the 2014 independence referendum have yet to be seen in Gaelic poetry. It may be that it's just too early to tell how these events will manifest. There's also the chance that what was an important year in Scotland will not impact in the same significant way on Gaelic poetry, simply because Gaelic as a language and as a culture maybe didn't play the major part in the independence debate that we might have thought it could have or would have. Perhaps what we are seeing is a shift in emphasis relating to a Gaelic form of political engagement, so a shift away from Sorley MacLean's politics. The new Gaelic poets are more engaged with identity, politics of translation, language politics, explorations of new Gaels, what it means to be a Gael, what it means to be an urban Gael, and indeed international Gael. How they will interact with this kind of proposed historical blueprint of Gaelic political engagement through poetry still remains to be seen. So I look forward to that. Thank you.